first of all, thanks for the introduction to Watford Writers, and it's fantastic that through technology we can all meet up like this. I know it wasn't quite how Chris envisaged it when he suggested this meeting, but hey, here it is and here we are. So by way of a quick introduction to me, I have a background in drama teaching. I was a drama teacher for about 12, 15 years, and then I retrained as a and both these careers I think have fed into the way I've approached the writing in Where Are the Grown-Ups. It's, in shorthand, I would call it a multi-generational family memoir. I really enjoy reading memoir myself, much more than fiction, because generally I find that real people are much more fascinating than anything you can make up. And that probably has something to do with my journalistic background. So tonight, what I'm going to do is give you a little of the background behind the book, talk about how I approach the writing, and read a few examples from the text. And then I'm really excited to take your questions and find out which aspects of this are of interest to you. So Where Are the Grown-Ups is my first book. It's about me, my mother Sylvia, and the grandmother I didn't know called Rose. And it's really a reflection on the impact of a hidden tragedy in my family that affected all of us. And that was namely Rose's death at the age of 25. So this is a true story about real people and real events in a specific period of time. Some parts of it are written from my perspective, my own lived experience, and other sections rely on historical research and information that I gleaned from historical documents, archives, and journals. And this kind of writing, as you probably know, goes by a number of names. It can be known as narrative nonfiction, literary nonfiction, or creative nonfiction. And Lee Gutkin, the American writer who's a leading light in the field of creative nonfiction, has a very good definition of it, which I really like. And he categorizes it as true stories well told. And that's really what I was aiming to do. I was aiming to tell a true story and tell it really well. So the creative part of nonfiction for me is really how well the author can use the fiction writer's techniques to create characters, scenes, and dialogue that show and explain the situations and the motivations rather than just relaying the facts. When I started writing Where Are the Grown-Ups in 2015, I really didn't know if I had a story that would make a book. When I began writing, I had no real concept that it would turn into a book. My writing really started as a response to grief. My mother died of a stroke in 2015, and I was living in Dubai when she was taken ill. So I flew back from Dubai to be at her bedside, which incidentally was Watford General Hospital, I'm sure you're all familiar with. I was with her for the week preceding her death and at the moment of her death. And when I returned to Dubai, I found writing was a very helpful way to process the experience. And the key point really about all this is that for very many of my formative years, my mother and I had a very bad relationship. It was unsatisfactory for both of us. And yet when she was in hospital and unable to communicate in the conventional way, something significant passed between us that had eluded us in all those years that had gone before. So in the writing, I was really seeking to unravel what had gone wrong. And I felt that there was something fundamental missing in my mother's childhood, and this had affected her very deeply. I knew that she'd been adopted as a tiny baby by a childless aunt and uncle because her mother had died. She knew next to nothing about her mother, and this missing part of her history and my history was thrown into sharp relief when, after my mother's death, I found some photographs that I'd never seen before of Rose, my grandmother, among her personal effects. And it really set me on a path to try and find out more about her. So the first part of the book is a first-person account of episodes in my childhood. And I used various ways to access some of those buried memories that would act as writing prompts, really, and get me to start thinking about the things that I needed to write down. And I found popular music and news events of the time were helpful. But the most helpful thing to me was reimagining, rethinking the geography of my childhood home. So the rooms, the objects, the layouts helped me to access the emotions that were connected to events and to put myself back in those moments, really. Now, we all know, don't we, that not everything about a life is interesting or fascinating. So memoir necessarily is curated to tell a particular story. And I was very well aware of that. I was accessing the bits of my life that I needed to tell the particular story that I wanted to tell. And this doesn't mean that episodes are untrue or dishonest. There could feasibly be other interpretations of the same events that I write about from other people's point of view. But I took the view from the very first word that this was my truth and this is the way I saw it. And essentially, what I recalled witnessing from about the age of 8 was the very slow breakdown of my parents' marriage. And I'd quickly made up my mind who was to blame. So I'm going to read you a couple of short extracts to illustrate what I mean by that. So we're in North London in the 1960s. It was a grey Saturday afternoon, and we were whirring through the London suburbs in Dad's Vauxhall Victor, a familiar journey we did at least once a month. I was silent in the back, listening to my own thoughts and trying to block out Mum's seething discontent in the front. The combined smell of Coty Lemon perfume and hair lacquer was overwhelming as usual. Opening a window was not allowed, unless I was going to be sick, which never happened. Dad passed me his crumpled white handkerchief just in case, but I put it on the shelf behind me. The merest hint of moving air in the car could never be tolerated, for fear it would compromise the achievements of the L-Net spray and its suffocating extra hold mist. Our house was also a sealed unit, because Mum said opening windows made the net curtains grubby with dust and let in dirt-loving insects. We stopped at some traffic lights, and with the engine idling, I stared at the passengers in the back seat of the car next to ours. A boy and a girl about my age were chattering, laughing, and bouncing up and down on their seats. Their mum in the front turned to share a joke. The boy suddenly looked across and smiled at me through the window. I stuck out my tongue and turned away just as the lights changed and the Vauxhall jerked forward. I imagined him telling his side of the story. "Mum, a girl in that white car with a red roof just stuck out her tongue at me." He'd be probably pointing in the direction of our car, and his voice would have a "that's not fair" whine to it. I looked through the back window, watched the car take a left turn and slip out of sight. The realization that I could be naughty without consequences was delicious. My mother wasn't the kind that other people had, one that played games with you during car journeys. She was the needy one in our family, the one whose mood could suddenly change, the one that must be considered, deferred to, and placated, or else Dad would get a tongue lashing. I hated her for that, and the way she held on to her simmering anger and resentment like a weapon, always ready to be reloaded and discharged. I often thought there must be something wrong with me for having those feelings. Before we left the house today, I heard her tell Dad he drove her mad with his timekeeping. I heard him remind her of the need to get ready when she hadn't yet completed her polishing and tidying rituals, and she must have noticed him looking at his watch. That would be the reason for the tense atmosphere in the car and the gesture of displeasure which was my mother's trademark. A slow look at the offending party, then the eyelids closing in contempt before the final defiant toss and turn of the head, followed by a long gaze out of the passenger window. Right, I don't know if you picked up from that, but my mother, apart from the difficulties she was having with the relationship she had with my dad, was an obsessive cleaner. And this made life at home quite oppressive because cleaning really trumped everything fun and everything spontaneous. Cleaning came first above everything. And I'll just read you another short extract to give you a little bit of a clue what the atmosphere was like in my house. Mum's strategy for keeping her domestic world in order involved a strict but predictable regime of household tasks that could not be altered, curtailed, or postponed. She called it being house-proud. She claimed to love housework, but it made her miserable and bad-tempered all the same. The pleasure lay not in the doing, but in the completion, when all evidence that we actually lived in our three-bed semi had been purged from every room. In addition to the daily washing, dusting, and vacuuming duties, every couple of months I would discover her bending low or climbing high in a bid to access all parts of the hard-to-reach places in our house. On those days, I watched her disappear away from me, searching for Narnia in the cupboard under the stairs, dustpan and brush in hand, or balanced on a chair at the bay window of the lounge, so the net curtains could be removed for another hand wash that they didn't need. The room faced onto the street, so when all 6 curtains were down, we were exposed to the full gaze of the world for the next 24 hours. Often I'd be drawing at the kitchen table as the cleaning continued around me. Installed at some height, the kitchen cupboards were an ever-present threat, for in her mind, these harboured unseen layers of dirt that must be routinely flushed out. A bowl of hot soapy water would be placed on the kitchen table, and then began a procession of tins and packets downward to any available surface. Cloth in hand, back up she'd go to wash and wipe the interior surfaces clean of the grime she believed was there. The food shopping and cooking duties were taken care of by Dad, who was a professional chef, but the organisation and storage of tinned and dry goods came under Mum's jurisdiction. When Dad needed anything from above, it was Mum, the keeper of the cupboards, who insisted on rising to locate the chosen item, passing it down like a museum curator handling a priceless exhibit. So I knew that my mother's backstory would be the crux of the book, but instinctively, I didn't want to tell the book in the story at the beginning. I didn't want to tell it all in chronological order because I felt this would be a much less interesting reader experience. I wanted to make the story more intriguing, and I wanted readers to wonder what had happened in the past to make my mother the way she was, and to want to know more about her and her childhood experiences. So going back to my drama teaching background, I suppose I was aiming to create some drama and suspense by letting the story unfold gradually. Part 2 of the book is told in third person omniscient, a point of view where the narrator knows the thoughts, actions and feelings of all the characters. And I suppose some people would say, if they're being really strict about this, how could I possibly know what really happened and what was said in the parts of the story that I didn't experience or witness? And this is the stories. My book is divided into 3 parts, and part 2, this is the case for most of part 2. It's beyond my lived experience. I knew the actions and I knew the outcomes as a child, and I also knew some of the key people that are mentioned. So my aim in the writing really was to get to the emotional truth of the situation and to create a satisfying and absorbing reader experience. And I can expand on that a bit later on. My main challenge really was how to construct my grandmother as a character. I had very little information. The information that I had were copies of her marriage and death certificate. And I also had my mother's very brief journal with some very sparse information concerning her lived childhood experience and a third-party impression of her mother. So the importance of the official documents that I could get, the marriage certificate and the death certificate, were immense. The death certificate really unlocked the mystery of the cause of her death, which was very vague. We were told died in childbirth. Well, what does that actually mean? What was it that actually killed her? And it wasn't until I saw the death certificate that I had an answer to that. And those documents also supplied other information like her occupation, her age when she died, her husband's occupation, when they got married, how long they were married before she died. And wearing my journalist hat, as soon as I saw the information in those documents, I knew I had a story. I had a structure that would provide a coherent frame, and I had a direction to work in. And I also had an indication of the research I would need to do, historical research, to put it all into some kind of context. So the research really involved medical history, midwives' accounts of the time, and hospital patient records from 1930, which I was very lucky to have access to the same archive that researchers on Call the Midwife use, which is essentially patient records from the London hospital in Whitechapel. The story is actually set in the East End of London, so it was very helpful to me to go to that source. I also read as much as I could about the Jewish East End of London, where the story takes place. And I didn't only read about it, I was doing a lot of desk research in Dubai, and as you can imagine, it's quite limited what you can find out about the Jewish East End in 1930 when you're in an Arab country. It's limited really to your PC and what Google can find for you. So when we came back from Dubai, I actually, this is a coincidence, but I actually found myself living in an area of London which was literally 2 streets away from where all the events actually occurred. And I found that extremely helpful to actually be in the place. I think there's a danger when you've got a historical period to write about that. And I know I reached this danger point where you research so much because it's outside your experience. So you need to fill yourself up with the atmosphere of the time and read as much as possible. But I think too much research can actually hamper the storytelling and almost be a distraction to the plot, because you know so much, you feel you somehow have got to put it all into the writing to make it credible and authentic. And I've certainly read books where I've been distracted because all I can really feel and sense is the author's scholarship. I'm being distracted away from the story because I'm being given so much information that they've obviously researched, and I didn't want to fall into that trap. So while I immersed myself in the period, there was a point when I put it all to one side and I just used a few key details to signify the time and the place and create the atmosphere. And I think I really only used what I felt was necessary to tell the story and create the mood of the time. So a third-party description in my mother's journal said that Rose, my grandmother, was exceptionally sweet-natured, dainty, and her marriage certificate said that she was employed as a cigarette maker, and this would have been in the late 1920s. So having done my research, I knew that in the late 1920s, in the cigarette tobacco industry in the East End, mechanisation was just coming in. And I thought about this and I concluded, and I don't know if you're going to agree with me, and I'm happy if you don't, but in my mind, new technology comes in, not everybody grasps it immediately, not everyone introduces it immediately. It often takes time for new technology to be accepted, to be, the mainstream, to be recognised as economically the right way to go. So bearing in mind this picture I had of her in my mind being dainty and this idea of mechanisation, I didn't want her to be in a mechanised environment. In my mind, she worked in a smaller factory where mechanisation hadn't yet come in, and she was a hand roller. So I wanted her to be dexterous with her hands. I imagined her actually being more of an artisan cigarette maker. And I had a little bit of evidence for that because her father, according to her marriage certificate, was a cigar maker. And I knew the family were from Dutch origin, and her father was born in Amsterdam. So in my mind, I thought her father was a cigarette maker. That's a kind of artisan craft. And it would be rather nice if his daughter kind of followed in those footsteps. So that's how I imagined it. So I created a scene where she was working in a small factory with her hands. And I really like the idea that father was passing skills to daughter. A family history researcher who was a friend, she was very interested in my family background, and she did some family history research for me and produced my family tree and got hold of the copies of the documents that I needed. She found out for me that when she was a child, Rose's family made several third-class trips to Canada by steamship. Now, I only found out last week, this has been a bit of a mystery in the story, and I don't really go into why they did it, but I believe there were relatives in Canada that they visited. But these trips, even third class, would have been quite expensive, and that was a bit of a mystery to me because they weren't a rich family at all. But I only found out last week that, in fact, Rose's father worked as a chef on those ships. So that to me suggests that they might have had a discounted ticket price. That also explains to me why they were able, when others weren't, to go back and forth, because in fact, it was part of her father's employment. So this was before the First World War, and the steamships all belonged to the White Star Line. So I had a bit of rummaging around about this. And of course, when she was, I think she did the last trip in 1910. Yeah, about 1910. And that's within 2 years of the sinking of the Titanic, which was also part of the White Star Line. So in my mind, it was a twist of fate, perhaps, that she wasn't on the Titanic. And I sort of wanted to introduce that idea into the story. And I thought it would be a good way of introducing a bit of foreshadowing that Rose's life was going to be quite short, cut short. So I thought it would be quite good if I had her fiance point out that his fears of her fragility, by pointing out the fact that that she could have been on the Titanic when they were discussing, you know, her childhood. And Rose's fiance was called Reuben, but he was nicknamed, for many reasons, Boy. So in this extract that I'm going to read you, which illustrates what I'm talking about, he's known as Boy. And there's a little bit here about her working in the cigarette factory. Lily Turner, the workshop supervisor, looked across the room with affection and pride. It was almost 5:30 p.m, but the 6 young women at the tobacco rolling tables were hard workers and usually had to be prompted to stop for the day. Mechanisation hadn't yet come to the smaller enterprises, but it was changing the way cigarettes were produced at the big factories, and Lily wasn't in favour of it. The idea that her girls, with hand-rolling skills passed down from their fathers, Dutch cigar makers all, might only be required to pack the machine-made products into boxes was unthinkable. Every morning, Rose and her colleagues lined up with their trays to collect handfuls of beaten tobacco leaves from the delivery box. At their tables, they stored the tobacco under a damp cloth, pressing it flat with a small roller. Placing a single cigarette paper on a square board, the experienced maker's fingers could judge the exact amount of tobacco required for one cigarette. The unruly strands were pulled from underneath the cloth, carefully laid along the length of the paper and rolled into shape on the board. The most delicate part of the operation was applying just the right amount of paste to seal the paper. When 9 or 10 cigarettes were ready, the maker aligned the ends for simultaneous trimming with a pair of small shears. Now, Lily notices that there's a young man waiting for Rose. She's looking out of the window. Opposite, there's a theatre called the Pavilion Theatre, and that's where he used to wait. He used to have his eyes trained on the window, waiting for Rose to finish work. So Lily calls across to Rose. "Rose, your young man's here again," she called, "as handsome as ever." "Take your apron off and go. What are you waiting for?" she said with an encouraging smile. "Oh, I don't know. Yes, I must hurry. And now I'm all fingers and thumbs undoing this apron," said Rose, laughing to herself. "Rosie, that's the 3rd time this week. How romantic," called Betty, with a sigh from her bench, prompting smiles and nods from the other girls. Betty had resigned herself to staying single. Her left eye turned inwards, and her mother liked to remind everyone that a defect like that ruined her chances with men. Rose lifted her coat from the hook in the hall, and pulling a soft felt hat from her pocket, she called out good night to her colleagues before making her way downstairs to the street. A year had gone by since he'd first tipped his cap to her on Friday night in the Mile End Road. The pavement was crowded with groups of single young men and women looking for romance. She recognised him from the market straight away, and the sight of him made her heart beat a little faster. The next week they stopped to talk as her companions strolled slowly ahead. She told him she worked at the cigarette factory, only a small firm, opposite the Pavilion, but he already knew as much. Something about the warmth of her response told him to be bolder. A few days later, he turned up outside as she left for the day. "I hope you don't mind," he said, twisting his cap in his hand, "but I was hoping you'd let me walk you home." The request was so endearing, almost childlike. When she looked in his eyes, she only saw the man he wanted to be. Now he waited outside for her whenever he could, and when he wasn't there, she dawdled, looking up and down the street just in case they'd somehow missed each other, and he was running to catch her up. It was on those walks together along Whitechapel High Street and the Mile End Road that they fell in love. He preferred to talk about her rather than himself. Her family background was less complicated than his and more conventional. 2 parents and an older sister, married with a baby boy. Grandparents that emigrated from Holland to Canada. No secrets to explain. He was happy to listen as she chatted away, explaining how her family made several trips to Canada by steamship. We still went third class, mind you, but it wasn't like in the old days. We had a cabin and proper food on china plates. I was only young, of course, but I can still remember the names of the ships, she said. Laurentic, Megantic, Teutonic, and Virginia. She recited the names like the 8-year-old she was when she learned them. I loved the sounds of those names. I used to write them down over and over in a little book to learn the spelling. Steamships on the White Star Line. So funny what you remember, isn't it? Boy stopped, unhooked his arm from hers, put his hands on her shoulders and looked deep into her questioning eyes. His hand gently brushed her cheek. She was a dainty girl, and there was a fragility about her that made him fearful. She searched his face for clues. What's wrong? Have I said something to upset you? You look so serious. He struggled to find the right words. It's just that, well, it upsets me to think, what if you'd never come back? He looked bereft at the mere thought. Let's not think about what ifs. We might have stayed, I suppose, but for the war starting. That's not what I meant, he said. Those poor souls on the Titanic expected to come back, but they didn't, did they? Same owners as the ships you went on, and within a year or two of your family travelling across the Atlantic. His train of thought revealed how much he cared. And there in the middle of the street, with the light fading, she threw her arms around his neck, and they stayed like that, clinging to each other, neither wanting to break free. It was November, and Mile End Road was foggy and damp. Men and women were hurrying home to the warmth of their loved ones. The owner of the hardware shop on the corner was bringing in the pots and pans that hung on strings outside the door. 2 children stopped to look at the buns left for sale in the baker's window, till their mother turned and called them to heel. Buses, delivery vans, horses and carts went on their way, but on the pavement, oblivious to it all, 2 young lovers clung to the life they saw in each other. So in some instances, I came across a fact that immediately conjured up a scene in my mind. In my mother's brief account of her background, she says that she was told that after her mother died, all the family met to decide what was to be done about this baby. Her father was only 24, and he came into the house where they all met, and she was told he was holding her in his arms, and he laid her down on a battered old sofa while the adults all gathered round and decided on a solution. And when I came to write that scene, I had to think about where he had come from. Before he came in holding the baby, where had he come from? And I decided that I would write it that he came straight from the hospital and he had his wife's death certificate in his pocket. In my book, he walks home from the hospital in Whitechapel and he walks through the streets of Stepney Green to his house, to his home. This is a possible route that he could have taken. I've walked the route and it's possible. But in reality, I know it didn't happen because the actual hospital where my grandmother died was too far away for that walk to have taken place. But actually, I don't think that detail is important. And I deviated from the exact facts because in writing that scene, I wanted to convey the terrible sadness of his situation and his helplessness. And I thought having him walk through the street, through his own community, as a father and a widower at 24 years old, it would heighten that poignancy, because on his walking route, I have him encountering members of the community, and he has to deal with their grief, and in one case, a lack of awareness over what has happened. And I just thought that would aid the reader's understanding of the poignancy of the situation. So as far as themes go in the story, one of the major themes that I had in my mind was inheritance. because there's a theme running through the book. When I started putting the story together, I found there was a recurring pattern through the generations, through 3 generations, a recurring pattern of mistakes and weaknesses, perhaps bad parent-child relationships. There seemed to be a pattern of behaviour that repeated itself through the generations. And I thought about all the things that we inherit from our ancestors in terms of physical things, material things, but also the skills and the talents and the interests. But perhaps we can also inherit weaknesses and mistakes and flaws in our character, because Where Are the Grown-Ups has a cast of characters that often unwittingly repeat the mistakes of the past. And that there is, through the generations, there are some controlling women. There's a succession of very weak men. There's a couple of heroic husbands and 2 monstrous stepmothers. And I thought, well, this is a very personal story. We all have challenging family relationships and difficulties from time to time. So I really hoped, and what I was hoping for when I completed the book, that the situations I described would help other people, other readers, identify with the characters and perhaps remind them of situations that have happened in their own families and in their own lives. And the feedback I've had suggests to me that that is the case. I've been absolutely amazed by some of the things that readers have come back to me. They've wanted to talk about their own difficulties after they've read the book, and similarities, and oh yes, I had a stepmother, and we had a tragedy. We had an illegitimate child in our family, and it seems to start a conversation that they haven't thought about. They haven't thought about having those sorts of conversations. So I've had deriving a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction from hearing readers' feedback and how they identify with some of the situations here. So I don't think I've paused for breath. So I'm just going to have a sip of tea. It's 8:15, and I know you have a little break. So I've been talking for quite a long time. I can carry on, but I thought maybe it's a good moment to just have a little pause, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions you want to ask me.
I'm just unmuting everybody.
How does that sound, Helen?
That sounds fine, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so if you want, I don't know if you want to have a break to refill your wine glasses.
What do you think, Chris? Should we go with the questions now, or should we just go and get our glass, get a drink, and
Oh, should we ask the majority? If you want a break now, would you put your hand up? So the majority want to stay, I guess, Helen.
I didn't really see. I was still busy unmuting everybody. Penny, have you put your own on mute? I can't unmute you.
She's out.
She's out. Jeff, there we go.
Andrew.
To leave you. I did remember to start recording after the introduction.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant.
So as soon as you started speaking, I did start recording. And that's just to let everybody know that Ruth has asked for us to record this for her. So if anybody has any problem with that, let me know if you did want to be recorded. Oh, Jeff, you're not on mute.
And David.
David or Jeff, have you put yourselves on mute? Because I can't take you off. Dave actually is frozen, isn't he? Oh, we might have lost Dave.
Yeah.
Dave's frozen. Jeff, you're still on mute.
I'm not
saying about mothers, my mum was very much a cleaner. She would do 4 spring cleans a year. Not quite to the degree, but emptying cupboards out, cleaning everything, cleaning the cupboard, put it all back. So I think it's that generation of
Yes.
That's all they to be a housewife.
Yes, and also I think it had a lot to do with my mother's situation when she was growing up in the East End, and it was such a hard slog to keep on top of all that sort of stuff with none of the conveniences and the appliances that we have now, you know, and the appliances were very messy, created a lot of dust. She had a pathological fear of dust, my mum. she really thought it could make you ill and encourage rodents and all sorts, you know. Yeah, it probably was a generation, but I think it went a bit deeper than that with my mum. I think she had a need to control her environment, I think. And I think the cleaning was all part of that.
Leslie, do you want to ask a question?
Sorry, I was going to say it's also about
Leslie's got a hand up. Sorry, Leslie's got a hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Leslie?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question. I wasn't sure, was part of the first bit written in the second person?
I don't think
Is that
so.
right?
No, all of the first section was written from my perspective, so it's first person narrator.
First person, okay.
Yeah, first person. Yeah. Part 2 is omniscient third, where I'm the narrator of everybody's thoughts and feelings.
Okay.
Andrea?
I was just going to comment on the cleaning thing. So my mother also behaved in that way, but not quite perhaps as anally as yours sounded she was. But I think it's to do with self-worth as well. I mean, women of that generation, my mother left school very, very young, and she didn't have any particular talents other than being a homemaker and doing stuff around the house, and they didn't go out to work. And this is how they saw themselves judged, by how their home was, how their home.
Well, my mum did have a career. She worked part-time. She was a secretary, and then she did other things as well. So the cleaning just seemed, it made her miserable when she was doing it, and it made her miserable if she wasn't doing it. It was an unsatisfactory relationship she had with cleaning, I felt. It was, we kind of messed the place up, to her mind, I think, just by our existence.
Can I just say something else? I really, really enjoyed your extracts and empathise with them, because my parents come from a similar kind of background, similar East End childhoods and so on, so I can identify with all of that. Can I ask you another question, which is, were you self-published or were you actually published with a publisher? How did you do that?
I was self-published, and there's many reasons for that, and I'm very glad I have done that. When I finished the book, I thought about how to get it out there, and I didn't want to wait for permission from a third party that would really only be interested in how much money it would make or how much money it wouldn't make. And I didn't want to waste that energy, and I didn't want to waste that time. I had sort of faith in the story, and I thought, if I get the story out there and let other people decide, let readers decide, it was really important to me, and I'm really glad I did it, because apart from being a journalist, I've got experience in public relations, and I wanted the challenge of seeing how far my own efforts in promoting the book would take me. And I've been amazed at where they've taken me. So I think I've had probably more publicity through my own efforts than a traditional publisher would give an author. You know, because the traditional publishers, they have a very limited budget and have limited resources on what they're prepared to do to put into one book. And as soon as that resource is gone, they're telling people, so where's the next book? You know, they're moving on very quickly. I published this a year ago, and I'm still getting promotional opportunities through it. I'm talking to a memoir writing group in Germany in a couple of weeks' time, and all the opportunities I've had, I've created myself. So when Chris was alluding before to radio interviews, I've been interviewed by 3 people on Radio London, BBC Radio London. I've done all the BBC stations near me, BBC Cambridge a couple of weeks ago, and BBC Suffolk, BBC Essex. I had a big piece. I wrote an article for a newspaper that was published a couple of weeks ago. I sent Helen a copy.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah. and you know the book's been out a year, so I'm getting a lot more results. It's taken me a lot further than if a traditional publisher had taken it on anyway. They'd be screaming at me for the next book by now, which I am writing, but it's just not ready yet.
We're going to come on to that in a minute. Ian, you had a question?
Yeah, I was quite taken by your comments about memoirs and things. I enjoy memoirs and diaries. That's what I read most of all. And
Yeah.
I enjoy the research probably more than I do the writing. But the difficulty for me, and I guess it was the same for you, was when to let go of the research and write the damn thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because you always think you don't know enough. Yeah, it's a tricky one because apart from the historical research, I had a mania for reading about the craft of memoir. You know, I wanted to great examples of memoir and also some how-to, you know, of good authors on how you do it, how you approach the craft of memoir, and you know, I had a really good list, and I got a bit too involved in those, and then you know, I sort of thought to myself, you know, I was reading and think, oh, I must remember to do that, I mustn't do that. I think there's a point when you just have to put it to one side, trust that the things have gone in, and just try and work your way through it. Because in fact, when I think back now, I broke a lot of the rules that I read about in the craft of memoir. I remember reading, don't change the point of view in the same book. And whatever you do, don't use third person omniscient because your readers will be alienated you. You know, so I broke lots of rules, but to me, that's the way I wanted to tell the story. And I sort of thought if I make it clear enough, then it won't be confusing. So it was in my mind, and I did actually. I didn't do all this in isolation. I should say. I belonged to a writers group in Dubai, and I started writing the book there, and I wrote about a third of it there. And I joined the writers group, who were very helpful. A group of American women, very far from the experience that I was writing about. So I thought they were a really good test group. That if this makes some kind of sense to them, if they pick up on the emotions and, you know, they get it, then maybe I'm onto something. They really were very, very helpful in showing me how to make it better, and very motivating, very encouraging, and also, you know, rightly so, very critical, which is what I needed. And when things weren't working, they would, you know, give me some hints about how I could make it better. But what I was doing with them, I was submitting every fortnight, and I was writing for them. So each fortnight, that would mean I'd have to get the next chapter ready for the next meeting. So they were reading it as I was writing it, and I found that really, really helpful. And I just left Dubai. They just got to learn about how Rose died. And they said, "Oh, don't leave before we know that." So it was nice that they kind of followed the story as it was unfolding. And I really don't think I could have got as far as I did without their input, actually, because it really, this is when you're a journalist, you're used to writing articles that are very brief. You know, everything's about editing down. I mean, I really doubted my ability to write an extended piece and to keep being interested enough to get to the end. I did, you know, it's quite an achievement. I mean, I don't know if any of you, if you've ever embarked on that, but it's amazing, really. And I'm pleased with myself because I didn't think I could ever do it. And now I've done it once, I know I can do it again. So if you're thinking about writing a book, or any of you, just go for it.
Sue Bennett.
Can I ask, did you put any photos in, Ruth? Did you illustrate the book?
I didn't illustrate the book for reasons of, it just made the publishing process more complicated. But in most of the talks that I do, you know, physical talks, I've got a selection of photographs that I actually put up, and people really like that. The photograph on the cover is my mother of 3, and there's a photograph on the back of my grandmother and grandfather on their wedding day, and those are my photos. There's a backdrop is a photograph I took of a place in the East End that was very relevant for me. So that's my photograph. But I have got family photographs. People seem to want to know, what did Sylvia look like? What did there's various other characters. What were Becky and Jack like? And my dad's a character. What did he look like? So when I do talks, there are photographs that I display, which Chris would have seen, because Chris came to the launch of the book, which I chose a theatre in the East End of London to launch the book. So yes, is the answer to that. There are photographs in the book.
We didn't get the newspaper piece on the website, did we? Newspaper article?
No, but we can post it up there if that's all right.
That's got some photographs on there, hasn't it?
Yes, there's a photograph, a portrait of Rose, which is one of the photographs that I found in my mother's personal effects that I'd never seen before. And it's a head and shoulders shot that's like a wow photograph that I couldn't really put it aside. And that's really what sent me on the journey to find out more about her.
Beautiful lady.
We've put the link on for your book, Ruth, on the website, but we'll update that as well.
Oh, I didn't know you had a website.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Ian's the webmaster. Ian's in charge.
I'm in charge.
Is there other examples of all your writing on there?
Some. Yes.
Some.
Yes.
Right. Okay. No, I'll have a look at the website. I had no idea you had a website.
Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone is interested in the, there's more detail about the research I did in the article that was published. So if you want to share it, then please do. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that tomorrow. I'll post it tomorrow.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Dan, you had a question?
Yes, I wanted to thank Ruth, to say how much I enjoyed listening to you reading the extracts that you did, and they made me want to read the rest of the book, which is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Which I hope to do. But also, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who grew up, brought up by somebody with this obsession with cleaning and so on, when you eventually came to have your own home, what effect did it have on you? Did you, for instance, never buy a duster or refuse to have a Hoover in the house or something? You know, what effect did it have on you? Do you mind?
No, I don't mind you asking at all. It's a very interesting question. In fact, I said at the beginning that the book is divided into 3 parts. And I said at the beginning I was watching the breakdown of my parents' marriage. Well, part 1 ends when they split up, really. Part 2 is all about my mother's childhood, and that goes through to where my parents met each other. And part 3 comes back to my point of view. So part 3 is after my parents split up, what happened to me after that. So that's part of the story too. And I can tell, I'm coming back to the cleaning. I recognise in myself that when I'm in the periods of my life where I have been unhappy, I have turned into that obsessive cleaner that my mum was, which is quite disturbing, really, when I look back. And there's one particular episode in part 3 where I had a very unsatisfactory relationship with a guy of my own age who was really, very controlling. And the relationship was making me very unhappy, and I didn't know what to do about it. But the symptom of my unhappiness is that I can't actually get out of the house in the morning because I have to go through all these rituals of cleaning. And that really happened. It really happened. I wasn't making that up. And, it's associated in my mind with unhappiness, really, that kind of behaviour. That's not to say, I think if my children were listening to this, they'd have something to say about it. I am a tidy person. I am I don't like mess and dirt and everything. I think I've lost the obsessiveness about it. I can let it go. In fact, my mum used to really upset me that my mum used to say, well, I wish I was like you, and I wish I could just let the dust pile up like
Kind of compliment.
It reminds me a little bit of Ruby Wax's autobiography. Have you ever read that about her mother?
Yes. So she
very,
was,
very much like that.
her mum was Austrian or something, and I remember her saying that her mother had settees that had arrived with the plastic covering that was never removed.
And she used to clean the covering, wipe it over.
Yeah, I did identify with all of that. Yeah, it's very oppressive, you know, to live in that atmosphere, and I really didn't want that for my own family. So, like, you know, I had the kind of, I suppose I had the awareness of it, not to overstep that mark. But you know, I'm basically a fairly tidy person, but not obsessive. I think that's the difference. I think I'm in the normal range now. Hope. Whether my children would agree with that, I don't know.
How about
interesting.
should we have a quick 5-minute break?
Yes.
Because I think we have got more questions. I've certainly got a couple more. So let's have a 5-minute break, comfort break, whatever you need to do, drinks.
Okay.
Let the dogs out.
Yes.
Let the cat out, Ian. I can see the cat wandering in and out across the screen.
Toilet break.
Yeah.
Yes, he's a little devil. Come on, go see mum. Go see mum.
And I'm going to brush my hair because I had no idea this was being recorded and realised what a state my hair is in. But it's because I haven't brushed it yet. I've been mad working in the office all day and I just literally just scraped it up.
Hello, Sue Bennett.
Hello, Sue Pettit. How are you? Okay.
I'm fine, yes. Bit late joining.
But you got just as she started, so you didn't miss her. I thought.
No. Her name is Ruth. Ruth. It's here on my screen. It says Tim Badley or something.
Because his computer.
Right.
It ties in because mine's SB, because that's all I've got on my computer sign-in is SB, so let's pick that up. That's not me. But that is the way of keeping in touch until we can physically meet again.
Yes, I think it's excellent.
Although there's quite a few like Phil and Davy Boy and even the others that don't do it, and Rob. So some people and Geraldine.
Rob's not joined us yet, has he?
No, he won't do Zoom apparently.
We do Skype for French, is it? And Zoom for Watford writers. No, not Watford writers. We're Watford writers. Zoom for another group. So Skype and Zoom are both useful.
How it would have been without technology. I mean, technology has made a difference, hasn't it?
Oh, it certainly has. And we have done family quizzes, you know. I think that was, I don't know if that's Skype or Zoom or not, but yes. We're trying to get one organised with my daughter in Australia. But that's not a technological difficulty, that's a time difficulty.
It's an additional problem.
So press that. Which one? FM.
Have you got out and about?
X6 or FM. Right, okay. Oh, that's better. Thank you.
Ellen?
Yes.
I did write a poem.
Yes.
And I did get it on the computer. But when I wanted to attach it, I couldn't find it. So you haven't got it.
Oh, that's a shame.
No.
So had you saved it? Did you save it?
Oh, I always save things, yes.
I wonder why you couldn't find it. I have a folder.
I've obviously filed it in the wrong whatever.
You know, you can do a search on one of the words that's in there that wouldn't be in anything else if you go into the search box.
Well, I think Tony found it later on when it was too late to do anything about it. So,
That's a pity.
yeah.
I tend to save things onto my desktop that I want to, so I can find them
Yes.
easy, and then I'll put it into the file afterwards.
Yes, yes.
Because that's the only trouble, you end up with so much stuff and pictures and things, you can never find what you're looking
I
for.
really need to have a clear out of my laptop. It's getting ridiculous how much stuff is on it.
Talking of things on your laptop, Sue, how's Georgiana doing?
I have finished the last chapter. I'm going to put together as a trial book.
Fantastic.
And so I can sort of look at the draft to see how it looks and how it reads as a whole. I'm going to send it to the family. Because
it's wonderful.
Story.
Brilliant.
How big is the book in there, Sue? How many thousand words do you do in the end?
Oh, it's about 200,000, isn't it?
It's not huge.
Is it?
No. What's a normal novel length? What's an average novel length? Like?
70 or 80?
Yeah.
How much?
70, 80?
Yeah, I'm about 60.
About 80,000.
90.
I'm about 60 to 70 off the top of my head. I can't quite remember without looking. But I haven't done an index. I haven't done pen portraits yet, which is the sort of thing I was thinking about in the reading list. So that would be an extra pages. But I thought I'd just do it to sort of go through and get the family to read it as well, to see if to pick it up. And then,
have you checked with any more agents or publish housing?
no, I haven't. I thought I'd finish first and then have a go. And if worst comes to worst, I'll do a self-publish of some form, just so she's out there.
Have you met the family?
I want a reserved and signed copy, please.
Well, as I say, the Watford writers will get the launch party invite.
Hey, we're organising it.
Yeah. But no,
there's a lot of time in it.
Well, I mean, there's so many names I'm hoping to pick up, and I've been able to tell somebody.
Do you want to tell Ruth about your book?
No,
I can be.
I can't. It's a story of the life and times, because I don't have enough to write a biography. But I came across diaries, a diary written in 1794, another in 1802, and I was able to identify the authoress.
Wow.
Who isn't a known name now, but her father knew most of the artistic and literary circles, so she knew Robert Adams, she knew David Garrick. And the hook that got me to write the story was I discovered that she married a man who had been a family friend, and her parents disowned her, and she was a much child. And her father gave me the book title, A Thankless Child.
Wow.
Sharper than a serpent's tooth to have a thankless child.
Yeah.
So she's been going for years, Watford writers, particularly Helen.
I've been with it from the beginning.
And again, it's been very useful to go to Watford writers, because when I first read out, it's very hard to read your own writing when you don't see yourself as a writer to start with. And they once said, well, you've obviously done your research, because it was fact, but where's the story? Where's you in it? And I couldn't understand that. So over the years, I think I've got there, and I've got my voice in, and I had to leave so much research out. You know, it's some things I thought interesting, but it didn't make the story flow. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then you've done the research, so you know you're writing from a point of view of knowledge. You know?
Well, it's some knowledge, but also I'm having to make guesses, because I don't have a lot. I have these 2 diaries plus a transcript of a third, a few contemporary letters, and a few contemporary mentions. So I'm having to look at, that's why it's a life and times rather than the book, because I'm sort of trying to get people interested in history.
Yeah.
She's the sort of focal point.
Yeah. Do you not think it occurred? I was having a conversation with somebody today. It's actually a university conversation, and we were talking about qualitative data and quantitative data. And you might think, well, why is Chris talking about that? We're talking about a history here and personal history. But the point for me is that those personal stories that you talk about, Sue, and that Ruth's written about, give you a way into the history. And for me, what you've talked about and what Ruth's talked about, and I know in my own family, women were oppressed in a very, very grotesque way, it seems to me. I mean, you talk about somebody marrying somebody that the parents didn't approve of. I know that happened in my family, that babies were taken away from people because the father wasn't approved of and they weren't married and all the rest of it. You know, and I think what a story like Ruth's does, as well as being superbly well written, is it takes you into the history of the times, and it's so much more impactful than an ordinary history book or some statistics ever could be.
Yes, because you start, as Joan was saying, you start to get interested. You want to sort of find out more, and because it's, the woman's voice has been for so many years.
No, the empty one's mine.
But it's quite fascinating how many women were, you know, in the 18th century, they ran manufacturing companies. They were the businessmen. They were the entrepreneurs. So they had to have a male fronting them because they weren't allowed to be seen to be doing this, although they were the brains.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff like that. I mean, in the same vein, if you've seen that time that's been mentioned too, where they take a house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tonight. It's on tonight. Yeah. Oh,
that's another way of bringing history to life because you're seeing it through the people.
Yeah.
Well, it's the social history that you're concerned with. When you're going inside home, you know, the big news events of the day. See, there was obviously some big news events going on in the period that I was writing about, but I just think to myself that the people that I was writing about had so many everyday concerns,
yes,
feeding fundamental things about how babies were going to be cared for, how they were all going to be fed, and you know, the basic things of life. But I think sometimes the big picture news events are not what they're talking about inside their homes.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really want to bog down with world events.
No, because they wouldn't have been common currency, no.
Dropped, you know, certain things in, but very, very lightly, really. I mean, obviously, when in the war years, then everyone's life changed, and I've got a scene in my book where my mother's evacuated, and that's a whole of disaster where she ended up, because that was, you know, essential. That actually disrupted the whole fabric of the family to have the children sent away. But I think
her need for control. You know, the sense of cleaning for control because her life had been broken.
Yes, yeah.
Control was, even though she hated
putting it in order. It's, a psychiatrist would say, trying to put her life in order, and that's under control. Yeah, I mean, she never lost that. You know, even when she was in his 80s, she was, you know, her home had this, there was always a smell of Jif, you know, but we had Ajax in those days, with that horrid powder stuff. It used to make my skin crawl if I could feel it on my fingers.
Well, my father used to have sneezing fits because my mum was always cleaning and spraying them, and he'd have these sneezing fits, and they never put two and two together until she died some years ago. And we realised, because he doesn't clean, sneezing. And I said, "Oh, you must have been allergic to the spray." She just overloaded him with cleaning spray.
It's the smells of those. I mean, that's the thing that brings your writing to life, isn't it? Those sensory memories that you have of smells, and always associate my mum with the smell of hair lacquer, and I cannot stand that smell. I cannot bear it. Ever I go to the hairdressers, they always say, "Would you like?" No, anywhere near me. And that's just that smell just sets my teeth on edge, and it's horrible. It brings back such potent feelings, you know. And I'm very glad they don't make Coty Lemon perfume anymore, because I don't think I could. I wanted to smell it when I was writing the book. But I think it might have brought back some horrible memories, so I'm glad it wasn't available.
Ian's got a question, then Andrea.
Well, yes, it really is just the observation about the smells thing, because I remember when I remember my grandmother, who I loved, you know, out of everybody in the family, it's things like the Sunday rituals as well, where everybody used to get dressed up, and there would be the Sunday afternoon tea, and she'd make salmon sandwiches. It was an event that she opened a salmon tin. And you know, on the Sunday morning, we'd listen to Desert Island Discs, you know, whatever, and she'd be making the fruitcake that used to last a week. You know, I mean, it was silly things like that, really. You know.
Yes, yeah.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because my tin salmon was like the height of luxury.
Yeah.
My mum. My parents came from different social classes, really, and there's a scene in the book where I go from, in fact, the scene after the first one I read, where I'm in the back of the car, we are actually going to see both sides of the family. So it's very clear to me at a very young age that my dad's family are a higher status in society than my mum's side of the family. And it's you know, in a very obvious way, the way they live. There's a bathroom at my grandma's flat, but there's only an outside toilet and a tin bath at my mum's side of the family. Little things, and what we ate, of course, the things that you ate, said everything. I mean, my grandmother had the china out, and there'd be sugar tongs on the tea table, and proper china, and blackcurrant jam, and you know, on the other side, it would be apple pie on an enamel plate. It's just those little things, and of course, no fridge. She had an underground scullery with a meat safe. You remember a meat safe with, instead of the fridge, it was like a cupboard with netting over, and a great big pile of coal because they had an open fire. So things like, I had a lot of rich material, really, to draw on. I had a lot of rich material. Those contrasts were huge, and to a child, because you don't really understand the subtleties and the ramifications, but you do observe, you know, the differences, and those are the things that you remember. It actually really surprised me at how much I remembered. People have read the book and said to me, how the hell do you remember that detail? And it's just very, very clear to me, very clear to me. But again, as I was saying, the writing prompt about the childhood home and the association of objects in rooms brought back very visceral memories, vivid. And the emotions, you know, right in your stomach that you felt at that time. So I don't know if, is anyone else doing anything on their family history?
Don't think so, no. Oh, Leslie, yes, of course you are, Leslie. You're on mute, Leslie.
Leslie. Oh,
yeah, I am. I'm doing something roughly based on my mum's experience of coming to this country in the 60s. Yeah, sort of early 60s. And so I was interested in what you said about reading around the craft of a memoir, because, maybe that is what I need to do, because obviously I'm not planning on making it a memoir, but it's based on her experience, and it's trying to bridge the gap between obviously things that she's told me, things that I've read, and also sort of creating the other bits. So if there's any sort of recommendations around crafting a memoir, that would be really helpful, I think, because that is where I'm kind of getting, I've got all of these tiny little stories trying into one.
Right, I've got actually I've got a list that I drew up for Family Tree magazine. Asked me to do a how-to writing your family history, and I compiled a list of useful books on writing craft, particularly with memoir in mind. So I could send that to Helen as a document.
Yes, please do.
That'd be lovely. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there's some useful ones on there. And also there is a list of memoir that I've found fascinating, because there's so many different ways to tell those kinds of stories. And I think if you can read the way other people have tackled it and look at some of the craft books, I think if you have both of those, they're really, really helpful. So it might give you an idea about how you could put those stories together that you hadn't thought of, if you see how other people have done it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So
Did you look a family tree? Did you
Sorry?
look at drawing up? Did you look at drawing up a family tree, or
my
was it
friend?
just-
Yeah, I had a friend who
Yeah,
was
you
very
said-
interested in ancestry, and she did all the paperwork, you know, because it's very involved. And I just wanted to do the writing. I you know, give me the information and I'll do the writing. I wasn't really interested in so much in researching, you know, back, you know, to the 17th century. I just wanted this little 3 generations. That's what I was interested in, and I'm sure there's a lot more to know. But the further back it goes, the less it kind of inspires me, really. I wanted to write about something that I felt impacted my generation, and I didn't have to look that far back to find that. But certainly it was very helpful in getting the key documents that will really give me the storyline. You know, if you can get hold, if you've got any kind of, I wonder what she did or what date it was, if you can get hold of anything like marriage certificates or, you know, death certificate, official documents, what they reveal is quite extraordinary, and that will give you an inroad, because that's what they did for me. So
yeah. Sorry, there's a couple more questions, people waiting. So
Thank you.
Andrea and then Mike.
I forgot what I was going to say now. It was so long ago. I did make a note. There was something when you were talking about Rose meeting her fiance in the East End. There was a line you wrote which I thought was absolutely lovely. I wrote it down, which was, when she looked into his eyes, she only saw the man he wanted to be. And I thought that was the most beautiful line.
Oh, thank you. He's you didn't pick that up from that particular extract, but he is a flawed character, and through the book, I want the reader's sympathies to change, because he obviously, at the moment that he loses Rose and he has a baby to look after, he's only 24 years old, and that to me just is heartbreaking. That scenario is just heartbreaking. But later on, he makes some bad decisions, and he betrays his daughter quite badly. So he's a complicated character, and I wanted the reader to sort of be sympathetic on one hand, but then to expose him in another way, and to perhaps have your sympathies change a little bit as the story goes on. But he's a fascinating character, actually, and he's got a whole history, an unfortunate history himself, which comes out. He was illegitimate, and that he never quite gets over that, and the stigma of that at that time. So he's quite a lot that he has to deal with, and he hasn't covered himself in glory up until that moment, but of course Rose sees something different. So I wanted to show that. Thanks.
Well, can I just say, were these people that you're writing about, did your parents talk to you about their parents? Did your mother talk about her parents to you?
My mum didn't know anything really about her mother. So all we knew is that she died in childbirth. That's all we knew. I actually met her father, who's my grandfather, when I was, I must have been about 8 or 9, and he came to the house. So I remember meeting him, but she told me a lot about him, and I had a lot of evidence of what he was like, because he married again after Rose died. Very swiftly after Rose died, he married again, and it went downhill. The relationship went downhill from then on, for various reasons, and a lot of what had gone before was covered up, not spoken about, and that was the damaging thing, really. That it was as if Rose had been airbrushed out of history, because the new wife certainly didn't want to hear about her, and the woman that adopted my mum certainly didn't want to hear about her either. So there was a conspiracy of silence about Rose, and I feel I've broken that conspiracy of silence, and I've got her back into the history of our family where she, you know, she'd been buried, literally. So, and I feel I've given her a longer life than she was allowed in writing this book. So that, to me, very satisfying, because
You've put her back you've put her back where she belongs.
yes, yeah, absolutely, put her back where she belongs. Yeah.
Mike?
Oh yes, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say how much I enjoyed the extracts that I read this afternoon.
Yeah.
And what it did, I thought it was very evocative and very emotional as well, reading it. Having lost my own mum about 3 years ago, and so, you know, it took me back really to that a little bit. But what it did, it also set up a very interesting conversation between myself and my daughter. She's 20, he's 25, about what memory really is, and, you know, how trying to actually remember an event. There are so many things that happened 50 years ago, and how you can actually remember the details of that, and how sometimes I'm sure you're remembering stories that have been told and retold, but also the importance of things like photographs. And in fact, sometimes if I'm trying to remember my dad, quite often just it's a photograph that comes into my head when I'm trying to remember him. Just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, photographs have been absolutely key to the whole journey of this book, really. The discovery of them, ones that I haven't seen before, obviously were potent in the storytelling. But also, you know, finding photographs that I had seen before but I'd forgotten about, that show me as a child in various situations. And really they were just writing prompts. They really were, as soon as I saw them. I think if you've read the first 3 chapters, you might paragraph where I'm talking. I found a photograph where there's me talking to a little dog on wheels that someone has bought. It's sort of the sort of thing that children learn to walk with. It's got a handle. Yeah. I saw that picture and I saw my pose, and I'm sort of crouched down and I'm eye to eye with this toy dog, and it was as if I was back there on that garden path, you know. And I could feel the fur of the dog.
We're also saying that it's you know, the things that we remember are very often associated with a very strong emotion.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, okay, I can remember falling off the tree. I must have climbed lots of trees, but I don't remember climbing all the trees, but I remember the one that I fell off, or I remember the dog that frightened me. You know, and it's those things are the things that make a memory stick, and you can you know, you retrieve them 40, 50, 60 years later.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any kitchen with cupboards up high, you know, and immediately, you know, they're a threat to me.
Yeah.
They were so much part of my childhood. One thing I would like to say about this book is that although it's a very sad story in places and obviously poignant, I didn't want it to be humorless, and I've tried to write certain scenes with humour, although that some of them are quite, how should I say, you know, emotionally charged. But I've tried to retain some humour in part. For example, the cleaning thing. When I was a teenager, of course, when you're a teenager, the rules don't apply, or the rules get relaxed, don't they? So what happened one episode when I was a teenager, I was effectively ambushed in my house by some friends that gate crashed my home when my parents were out. And there was a group of, there was 2 boys and a girlfriend. And of course, we were anxious to impress the boys. But I was fearful of these strangers running amok in the house, and they did. And they helped themselves, which isn't, when I think about it, it's not a crime. But they helped themselves to what was in the kitchen cupboards, you know, food wise. They were teenagers, they were hungry. What have we got to eat, you know? And I was so anxious about how I was going to sort out what was now a crime scene before my parents came home, because the cupboards had been interfered with, and I knew my mum would know immediately, you know. And of course, you know, I get found out, and I've tried to write that sort of reasonably humorously, but if you actually think about it, I shouldn't have been that fearful about it. You know, came round.
My boys do the same thing, nicking all the biscuits out of the cupboard from behind me.
Just now.
They are quite high cupboards, actually, Dave.
Exactly. You know, it's the control that my mum exerted that I don't know why I was so obedient, but she had the same attitude, that her aunt really was very controlling, and she just obeyed. And she said to me, I don't know why I didn't rebel. Well, I felt the same. I don't know why I didn't rebel. But we didn't. So there you go. The pattern was repeating itself.
Dave, you got a question?
I thought you caught the time of it. Going back to that, you didn't rebel in those days. You did all the things that you did. So if anyone went off with someone they shouldn't do and things, it was a completely different time to now. Whereas teenagers now, they just literally walk in and do whatever they want to do because they think they've got their God-given right to do it. But even I was growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, which is probably a bit after that, you still had this conformity that you had to stick to almost, and if you broke that, you were almost a social pariah for doing it.
There was a sense of shame, wasn't there, which we don't have now. You know, you made to feel shameful if you broke the pattern of what you were supposed to.
And as you said, they were quite strict rules, and in some ways they were ludicrous rules, but those were the rules you had.
Jo, have you got a question?
I do, yes. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I've really enjoyed it. I do have two questions, really. One is, on the website, we've got a link to where we can find a Kindle version, but is there anywhere that I can get an actual hard copy of your book?
Yes.
Amazon too?
Amazon. It's paperback and Kindle on Amazon.
Fantastic. I obviously didn't look properly on the link. Thank you. And because obviously this is, it's your family story. It's a personal story. Did you find, obviously I can completely understand writing it, but then did you feel a bit, how did you decide how much of yourself to actually give away?
Well, that's a really good question, because there were several points in the book where I thought, do I really want this out there? Do I really want to say this? Do I really want to make this bit public? And do you know what? I think when you're writing memoir, and I think the reason people enjoy this book is because I am honest, and I don't sugarcoat anything. People have said to me, it's really authentic because it's you're not holding back, you're not hiding anything. It feels honest, it feels real. And I think that's the territory of memoir, really, because I don't think there's any point writing memoir unless you're really expressing the truth of your situation and how you feel. So while there was a point when I was slightly worried about whether I wanted to put A, B and C out there, I thought, well, this is the territory. This is what I've signed up for. And, you know, if I dodge over this bit, or if I, you know, fudge saying that, this, that and the other, then it's not going to be real. I did work with an editor at some point who was very outside the experience of the book. And I thought it was good, because I thought, well, if he gets it, then obviously, because this is completely outside his cultural experience, then I'm communicating it in the right way. He thought I was very soft on my mum. And in part 3, you'll see that as we both get older, there is a little bit more understanding. And he thought I was a bit soft, and how can you let her get away with that? You know what? I thought what he's not understanding really is the mother-daughter relationship. And while he understood everything else about the story, he was missing that bit, I thought, because I don't know what you ladies think, but it's complicated, a mother-daughter relationship, and love is complicated, not black and white. And I think he wanted to make it black and white. So although people say you should always listen to your editor, there was a few times when I didn't, and I regret it. No reader has come back to me and said that they didn't believe this or they didn't believe that. But they all found it very believable, very credible, and that, you know, so I think it was justified. I've gone off the point of what Joe was saying, but I'll come back to that. There was another aspect of it that worried me about being completely truthful, and that was, what will my family that are still alive, what will they make of it? Because I've got a brother 10 years younger than me, and he had, his experience is different. I'm not talking for him. I didn't want to talk for him, and I didn't want to make him a character. I didn't want to put words in his mouth. I wanted to tell my truth. So he appears as a kind of very shadowy presence. There's points when you understand that I now have a sibling, and he appears, you know, in a shadowy way. And I thought, well, he's going to either think, why haven't you put me in it properly, or why have you said that about our parents? And you know, I was waiting for him to be sort of quite upset about it, but he came back and said it's absolutely 100% spot on. I agree with what he said, and he said things to me that I've never thought I'd hear him say, which was, yes, I was the golden boy and you were the one that was always criticised. So he kind of agreed with the way I told him and the way I saw it.
That's interesting, yeah.
Very gratifying indeed. So that was a relief. And the other thing that's come out of it, since the article was published, I've been contacted by a relative. And in the book, Rose has a sister who's a minor character called Hetty. But I know in reality that 2 years after Rose died, Hetty also died of TB. And she had 2 little boys. And that could be another book. I'm contacted by one of the 2 little boys who's now in his 90s.
Oh.
He read the article and he said, you've told, I lived that life. I know exactly what you're talking about. And we're going to have a Skype call because he wants to tell me, and I want to know what happened to him and his brother after his mother died. So, yeah, so a lot of good things have come out of it. A lot of good things, unexpected things have come out.
Well, ramifications.
Pardon?
Say the ramifications that follow.
The ramifications. I was prepared, and this might surprise you. Boy, I said married again, and he has got grandchildren who reside in America, and they are still alive. He had 2 other daughters. They must be very, very elderly, but certainly their children are alive and in America. I was waiting to be sued if they ever read it, because they might think I'm painting a rather picture of their grandparents. But you know, hey, I'm not telling anything that isn't factually true. So go ahead for it.
Said you're writing a second book. Is that also memoir?
It is a memoir, but it's completely different. When I was in Dubai, I started blogging, and I wrote about I'll go back a bit further than that. When I was a journalist, I worked for a regional newspaper group in Yorkshire, and I was the arts and features writer, and I introduced travel and food writing to the paper, and we produced a leisure supplement which I designed. So that's my background. When I went to Dubai, I started blogging about travel and food experiences while we were there, because the thing about Dubai, as Chris will know, is it's all fantastic places you can visit from Dubai, because it's such an amazing travel hub. such an amazing centre. There's places you can visit that you might normally, perhaps from here, not consider. So we had lots of interesting trips hither and thither, and I wrote about it and blogged about it. Now, when this present crisis started, I was kind of inspired to look at some of that material again, because travel and eating out are two of the things that we can't do in the current situation, although things are easing now. But when I started thinking about it, it was in March, just before lockdown. And I thought, well, I think I could actually put together quite an interesting collection of just short pieces on travel and eating out from the perspective of the lockdown, where these things become almost nostalgic memories. So that's what I'm doing. It's called Bite-Sized World, and I'm quite far into it now. And it should be just a pick up, easy read, no big psycho dramas going on, not really analysed, just hopefully entertaining, and perhaps a look back when the world was turning, because it's kind of stopped a bit now, hasn't it? That's what I'm working on at the moment.
Andrea?
I'm also working on the audio book for Where Are the Grown-Ups, which I'm doing myself. We've done all the recording, and my husband is now going over it with a fine-tooth comb and editing out all the extraneous breaths and all the rest of it that you have to do when you produce an audio book. So in answer to Joe, who's wondering if there is a paperback, there will soon be an audio version, a paperback, and a Kindle, which are already ready to go. So hopefully the audio by the end of the year.
Waiting for the film rights.
Yeah, if only, golly. Yes, it would make it. Somebody said to me that would make it.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, if anyone's got any contacts,
They'd not.
I don't think my PR extends to interesting a Hollywood producer, but you know, Chris, you're very well connected. Perhaps you can find one in Dubai.
Well, actually, other people won't know this, but we're both on Dubai. Is it Instagram tomorrow as actors? Ruth and I are both acting in Dubai tomorrow, virtually, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. I'm going to be reading from the book though.
Okay.
Because it said trailblazers, so they want to know what you've done since you left. So I'm going to be reading a different part. Actually, I'm reading a dialogue where I am both my parents having an argument. That's what I'm doing.
Sorry, Andrea's been waiting for a little while to get a question in.
Well, it was more of an observation again. When you were talking about family reactions to your memoir, it reminded me of my father, who wrote 2 memoirs of his East End childhood, which did very well at the time. And he wrote them, and I think they were first published in 1963. And as a result, one of his brothers never really forgave him. And I would visit this brother. I mean, they had a falling out for many years, and it wasn't until my father died and I visited this brother who was then 100, and I visited him for the last 3 years of his life in a nursing home, talked to him a little bit about the past, and what he hadn't liked was the fact that my father had spoken about the poverty that they had living in an East End slum, and the rats, and you know, my father was one of 7 children, and his mother worked a stall in Petticoat Lane, and he was brought up by his grandparents, and my uncle was incredibly bitter about the childhood that they had and resented the fact that my father had written this book because he felt that there was stuff that he shouldn't have spoken about. And that caused, I didn't know about that until much later in life, that it caused this. That was the reason behind the falling out.
That's fantastic. What was the book called that you're...
There's 2 books. Yeah. I think one can still get them buy them very cheaply on Amazon now. One called No Tears in Aldgate. And the sequel is called Spring in Aldgate.
Right, I think that rings a bell with me. I haven't read them, but I think I tried to get one of those and it was out of print or something. How amazing.
There's a very good place where you can get out of print books. It's called abebooks.co.uk for everybody at Watford Writers. Abe Books, where you can buy books secondhand very, very cheaply, or textbooks, or anything that's out of print, or just you can't buy on Amazon, or you want to buy it cheaper than on Amazon. Book dealers all over the UK are flogging their books on Abe, and that's quite a good source of finding books.
I'll have a look at that. It's interesting what you say there about people wanting the truth to come out. Very interesting. Before, a long time ago, when my dad was still alive, I interviewed him about his life, and I wrote it all down, and I used his voice really. So what I was doing, I was actually transcribing from the recordings. I asked him lots of questions about his life, and I told it in chronological order. And I had this book bound, and it was never intended to be published. This was something just for the family to keep. And my dad thought it was wonderful, and he wanted lots of copies of it. So we got a few copies done, and he had 3 brothers, and he distributed this to his brothers, and it caused an absolute furore. Absolute furore, because one line that my dad had said, of course I'm transcribing all this, and in one line he said that his brother had an arranged marriage, right? He actually said that, because my uncle married his cousin, right? They were cousins. And my dad said that there was this girl, and there was his brother, and they make a nice pair, but they were cousins. Well, let's just check with the doctors that this will be okay. They were advised not to have children because they were first cousins, and they got married, but it was kind of arranged between the relatives, and they took massive exception to this. Arranged? It was love. How dare you? I'm never speaking to you again. And it caused an absolute ruction. So I was kind of I was a little nervous about what might happen with this, but luckily it's only been good things. It's the best thing I've ever done as far as family goes. The only thing I regret is that I couldn't tell my mum about it and about the things that I discovered about her mother. But without giving too much away, in part 3, I kind of do, in a way. I do get to tell my mum, but you'll have to read the book to find out what I'm
don't give it
out there.
Anybody got any more questions? We all done?
Oh, Ian's got one. Helen.
Who? Ian.
Well, it's only a point about libel, because you were a bit worried there on the legal aspect. Obviously, if somebody's passed on, you can't be libelled for that. But if there's something in the story about the family and you're worried about it, I suggest you get a decent solicitor.
I'm not worried. No, I know you can't libel the dead, but I suppose grandchildren might take exception to what I've said about grandparents. But hey, nothing I've said is untrue. It's all so that's the way it goes, I think. One thing I did have to change, and this might be helpful to any of you. The original version of the book had a lot of song lyrics, because I find music very, very evocative of emotion and time and place. I included in the first draft quite a lot of snatches of lyrics which were meaningful to the characters in the story, or meaningful to the time, conjured up a sense of time. And before I published, I checked on using these lyrics. In fact, I had a dedication which used a song lyric, and I checked this out, and it's a minefield. Do not ever include song lyrics in your work, because it could cost you a fortune. I found out just on the dedication. Of course, I chose a song that had 4 writing credits. So I did it all above board. I wrote to the music, explained what I wanted to do, and they came back with, so it would have cost like an enormous amount of money times 4 because 4 writers. So it went. I just suddenly decided that the dedication really wasn't that important.
No.
I looked at all the instances that I'd used song lyrics. None of it, it all meant something to me, but none of it added to the story. None of it pushed the story forward, or, you know, it was really luxury items that I thought were very significant, but they weren't at all. And I don't think I've lost anything by getting rid of them. I've saved myself a fortune. So if you're thinking of using any lyrics, even in a, you know, one line in a dedication, it's a minefield.
I think John Ward has covered that before, hasn't he? I think he had something in a story that he took out.
His novel, he was basing it on Sam Cooke, and he was using the lyrics of Sam Cooke.
Oh, that's right, in his yeah.
What about when you do a parody, like I did that poem, you know, we'll eat out again to we'll meet again? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Do you think there's a problem there?
No, I don't think you'll have a problem there. I think it's as long as you recognise it as a parody, and there are similarities, but I don't think you'll have a legal problem there. No.
Sorry, that depends very much on how much of the lyrics is exactly the same. If you've got a percentage of it that is exactly the same as the original, then you're going to have trouble.
Oh, Andrea's thinking now. I can see the cogs going. There was one point, Ruth, I think everything I've written down people have covered in different questions, but I just wanted to say about the too much research and getting it in there. There have been people come to Watford Writers, and it's so evident that they have spent a long time researching and they've got to get it all in, and the time they step back from that. I read a book by Ian McEwan that was all told from the fetus's point of view. I can't remember the name of the book.
Wow.
Nutshell. And he gets in all about how much he knows about wine. It's about this fetus knows all about the best wine and where the vineyard it came from and everything. And it's just bizarre. And that to me is an example of not putting too much in. So I thought it was really interesting that you brought that up as well.
Yeah, it can happen so easily. You don't realise you're doing it, you know, trying to get everything in. And it's just a question of deciding what is really necessary to tell your story. It's not about proving how much you know, really.
It's just a little essence, isn't it, of something at that time without having to go into the full details.
I don't know if any of you have caught any of the Hay Festival online. I was listening to, it's been brilliant, hasn't it? I was listening to Hilary Mantel yesterday, and she was saying, I mean, you know, she's up to here with her research, isn't she? And even she said you've got to be really careful that it isn't obvious to the reader that that's what you're doing, you know, putting in all the stuff that you've found out, because you know, it's tempting, but I suppose in your first draft you could perhaps get it all out and then just
get it off your chest.
Yeah,
take it out when you realise there's too much in there.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a particular problem.
Hold out and leave the story behind.
Yeah, exactly.
I think when you're writing in the third person, I think that's when it really grates on the reader, because you can start hearing the author speaking to you instead of the story happening. Whereas in the third person, I think you can get away with it more because it's your voice anyway. So
yeah. I tried to be sort of reasonably subtle, but then you want readers to identify with some of the things that you've found out. Like the response I've had from lots of you tonight said, "Oh yes, you know, I remembered that, and that was like that in my family." So you want to sort of be very selective, really, and the more I sometimes think the more personal it can be, the better. It's being too general that history can weigh a bit heavy, I think.
Definitely. Okay, well, we're coming up to 9:30, Ruth. We didn't think we'd managed to fill up the 2 hours, but you have. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your.
Thank you.
For having me.
Did you want to say something?
Sorry?
Did you want to say anything?
I just want to say I thought that was a fantastic session, and I think we've all learned from it. I know I certainly have. And I think what Ruth says has related to what other people are doing. I know Leslie's the only person who's writing a similar type of story, but there are lots of people in this group, Ruth, who are writing historical fiction. And
Yeah.
I think what you've said is really, really helpful for them, I'm sure. And it was hugely entertaining. And the fact that we didn't actually start the second half, this is still a continuation from the tea break, tells you, it's like any good lesson. The children are disappointed when it comes to an end. So I think you did a fantastic job, and thank you very much.